Many countries are in the grips of intense summer heat waves that are causing some of the world's crucial rivers to dry up in parts of Europe. Waterways have dropped to near record levels, halting marine traffic and disrupting factories and industries, and even farmlands are parched. Germany's most important shipping route and crucial river, the Rhine, is running dry, and the drop in water levels are threatening its shipping industry. That's not only affecting freight, supplies and costs, but the energy sector as well. The disruption presents another challenge for Europe's largest economy at a time of high inflation, global supply chain problems and natural gas crisis. Economists are now warning this will have an effect on the region's economic growth. This is All 24 News special coverage. Hello to the program. I'm Karim Zachary. And today I would like to raise a question. What can the European bloc do to turn things around amidst an economic crisis? As far as drought is concerned, scientists warn it could become Europe's worst drought in more than 500 years. Water scarcity has hit more than 60% of the continent from Italy to UK. An unusual dry winter and scorching summer heat reduced rivers to trickles. The historic water reserve laws have forced governments to restrict supplies. Well, that shortage is seriously affecting nearly everything from agriculture to the shipping industry. We will bring in our guest in a moment. First, many European countries are experiencing one of the most serious and dangerous crises in the last few decades. Drought is hitting the country's human structure as well as their economy. Let's follow this report.
Many European countries, including Italy, France and Spain, are facing severe droughts this summer, causing reduction in energy supplies from hydro, nuclear and solar sources.
We
still are observing high atmospheric pressure, which is leading to a rise in temperatures with a peak. We have temperatures reaching 38 degrees Celsius, or even 40 degrees in the southwest, but also in eastern France. This is worsening the current drought, with no rain expected anywhere in the country.
High temperatures across Europe have led to the lack of water in rivers and reservoirs, which significantly reduced the ability of hydro facilities to generate power.
There have already been years with several heat waves. But this year is still quite exceptional, because we have high-intensity heat waves, notably the one in July, during which we had 13 days of heat, as well as June heat wave. There have been other years, but these heat waves have been more and more numerous in recent years.
As preventive measures to any further crises, many countries have started directive measures to water usage. The restriction limits certain uses of water, such as irrigation of lawns, car washing, filling swimming pools, and hosing down pavement areas. They can also limit the availability of water in terms of volume, or the time when it can be used, and its purpose. On the Rhine River, water levels could reach a critically low point in the coming days, making it increasingly difficult to transport goods, including coal and petrol, as drought and energy crisis persist in the continent.
Normally you have more than 2 meters under the ship, but now you only have 40 centimeters in some places. And then for us the challenge is to get past those points without damaging the ship.
This crisis is considered the most severe since years, and it can be an additional challenge for European leaders and people, in addition to the energy crisis that is dragging the continent into ambiguity.
So let's go through this break and then we come back to welcome our guests. And joining us from New York is Christophe Rühle, Senior Research Scholar at the Center of Global Energy Policy, Columbia University. And from Bulgaria is Dr. Modestina Primova, Senior Analyst and International Climate and Sustainability Expert. Good to have you both with us, lady and gentlemen. A very welcome indeed. So let's start with you, Dr. Radustina Primova. So Europe has seen drought before, but let's put this into perspective. How big of a challenge is this one? Apparently, Radustina Primova is not with us for the moment. She's going to join us back, and we redirect the question to Dr. Christophe Rühle.
What challenge is this one? It depends which perspective you're asking from. If we're talking about energy, it is a significant challenge now, in particular in the context of the already decided embargoes against Russia. So the drought and the lack of transport capacity for coal, for example, comes right a few days after the European Union and the German embargo against Russian coal imports has become effective. The drought in the River Rhine and other rivers in France comes right at the point in time when, for several technical reasons, there's maintenance in nuclear power stations all over France. And water is usually used to cool them and cannot be used for that anymore. And finally, on the 5th of December, we have an embargo of the European Union against crude oil imports. On the 5th of February, we will have an embargo of the European Union against refined product imports. And of course, the Rhine and other rivers in Europe and in its biggest economy here in Germany are used to ship products. So that would be gasoline, diesel, heating oil, naphtha for airplanes, all across the country. It's about 400,000 barrels of diesel alone, and that is impaired as well. So it's not a disaster because it can be corrected by other fuels and by putting it on trains and so on, but it significantly makes the situation worse by increasing prices.
And Dr. Christophe Rühle, since you mentioned the Rhine, if the Rhine becomes too difficult to navigate, how big of an impact is that going to end up having in Germany, both politically and economically?
The case that you have barges which can be loaded only to 1/3 in many areas, and that is going to have an impact. It is already the case that at least one coal-fired power station is only operating irregularly now because you cannot simply there's no rail connection, so they always have received their coal with barge through the river and you cannot simply replace it. But it's the same basic scenarios. It will be replaced by rail. German economy and the infrastructure is good enough to do that. So it will not lead to outages or lights going out or anything like that. It's not a volume constraint, but it certainly will lead to more bottlenecks elsewhere in the system and all around to higher prices. And since energy prices are already exploding, last week in France, the price of electricity was the equivalent, if you translate it, of $1,000 per barrel of oil. So it's already very high. And so that is a severe problem because of the high costs.
Very nice indeed. And Dr. Radustina Primova, so Europe has seen drought before. So putting this into perspective, how, according to you, is this going to be a big of a challenge?
Yes, usually there are scientists from the Joint Research Center that already alarmed us that 63% of the land across the EU and the UK had either drought warnings or alerts, according to the European Drought Observatory this month. And we see these challenges already are huge across the continents. For example, in France, there are strict rules how far the nuclear power plants can raise the river temperatures when they discharge cooling water. And if record in case of low water levels and higher temperature means that the river is already overheated and they need to cut output. For the first time this year, because of the extreme heat waves in France, and particularly affecting the Rhine and Loire rivers, there were exceptions. The nuclear regulator this week allowed 5 plants to discharge temporarily cooling water. So given also the current energy crisis, one other particular example is the Danube River. and the drying out of the Danube River, which affected a lot Bulgaria, Romania, and also Serbia. They had to do the so-called emergency drenching. So digging deep the further challenge so that they could ensure the transportations of goods and services.
And speaking of transportation, Dr. Radostina Primova, the transport of coal, those power plants and nuclear plants are also being impacted by this drought, right? What's that going to mean for an already critical European energy situation?
This is going to exacerbate the energy security situation, and particularly in Eastern Europe, already in the wake of the energy spikes. But also I wanted to address another very important consequence for reaching EU decarbonization target. In the latest European Green Deal and the Sustainable and Smart Mobility Strategy, the European Union is trying to increase the role of inland waterway transport as one of the most CO2 efficient transport, because in the interway waterland transport, it is using 70% of the energy which is needed by the often congested road transport and 50% of the rail transport. So in the latest targets of the EU, it is planning to use this kind of inland water transport as a more ecological transport. And this kind of reaching these targets, emission reduction targets in the transport sector, will be severely also affected by this.
Very well understood.
And also have other cases, also in Italy, the drying out of Po River is affecting very seriously the agriculture, as 30 to 40% of the agriculture in Italy depends on the Po Valley.
Very nice indeed. And Dr. Christopher Ula, let me ask you this. How much will shipping disruptions impact Germany's economy?
You asked that before. So there's, again, two effects. One is through the normal shipping of goods. Most of that can be replaced by truck and rail. And then there's the effect on the energy sector, exacerbated by the maintenance season for the nuclear stations, and especially by the embargo against Russian coal imports. And when you think of the situation in energy, so think of the threat that in the winter there will not be enough gas being delivered from Europe, and think about what natural gas does. You can do three things with natural gas. You can have space heating, so that's the heating for households, politically very difficult to shut off. You can do power generation with natural gas, and you can do feedstock for chemical industry. Now, in power generation, and some extent for space heating, but especially power generation, that's the only area where we thought there would not be a problem, because natural gas can easily be replaced by coal, by wind, by the sun, by nuclear. We can generate power with everything. It's not true for space heating, it's not true for feedstock for industry. And now what this drought does, and the problems of delivering coal and the problems of keeping nuclear power running in Central Europe, is that it makes that last area, power generation for natural gas, also a problem, which was thought not to be a problem. So in a way, in an indirect way, but in an important way, this drought contributes to the squeeze in the coming winter, should Russia decide to limit gas imports into Europe further. And one more time, very important to understand, I don't think Europe is, despite some newspapers saying that, on the verge of a crisis or anything in volume terms. It's not a blackout situation yet, and it may still rain and all of that. But it certainly leads to an even further increase in prices. And that increases inflation and makes life for households miserable, and will lead eventually to some political reaction when people can't pay their bills anymore.
Very nice indeed. Dr. Radostina Primova, the cost of transport, as we just heard, are also impacted, and that's going to go on and be passed on to goods, right? What is that going to mean for people who are already struggling with the rising cost of living in Europe?
Well, that will inevitably, first of all, increase energy poverty, as we already mentioned. But it will also limit the options for more ecological modes of transport in Europe, because, as we know, some of the most ecological transport are considered the rail transport, now inland waterway transport. It will increase the pressure on road transport in particular, as already we know that there would be some limitation on the inland waterway transport. So this creates a problem not only in terms of prices, but also in terms of congestions and delivery of goods as well. And with the increasing fuel prices as well, this will translate in higher prices of food and also food crisis in general.
And Dr. Rodestina Primova, just to talk about the issue of coal here and how the flow of coal right now is in jeopardy. As I understand it, that means that there could be shortages at coal-fired power plants in the next couple of months. What kind of impact would a coal shortage have now, for instance, for Germany, especially as Germany is attempting to lessen its dependence on Russian gas? And perhaps Dr. Christoph Rühl could answer that just right after you.
Well, on coal, I would say that
That's fine. It's fine. You can go ahead.
Yeah. So on coal, we have in Europe the so-called just transition process going on. So coal won't be competitive anymore because of the ETS prices rising. So, for example, in Bulgaria, according to a report, each year the Bulgarian government spent around €500,000 in coal subsidies. So the coal power plants, according to some of the scenarios that we have developed, most of them will close by 2030, and also it is expected that already by 2026, so the majority of the coal plants won't be competitive anymore. So currently only there is a lower percentage of utilization of the coal fleet, which is also increasing the prices per se. So the tendency is actually to close down power plants. In Bulgaria, we're discussing also currently about what should be the time frame for closing the power plants. In one of the latest documents on territorial just transition plan, the government has mentioned 2038 as a date for closing down the power plants. However, this is still subject to parliamentary votes.
And I would like to hear Dr. Christoph Rühl's contribution to this question.
I think a little bit differently from the previous comment. I think the impact on the energy transition will be severe. First of all, in the short term, obviously, much more than taking away the transport transition by eliminating water transport and rail transport. Much more importantly, the immediate impact on CO2 emissions from keeping coal-fired power stations running, or as was the case in Germany, putting some into service again, which were already shut off, is going to be dramatic. So all the short-term carbon targets of Europe and Germany will be out of the window. That's already, I think, pretty obvious. But also in the long term, we are learning a lesson here, which is that if one cannot guarantee energy security, and energy security, I mean affordable and available energy, if the lights go out, if it becomes too expensive for people to pay, the transition stops. Nobody is interested in spending more money in coal or wind in a situation like now, where one literally has to generate every support system for energy security to be there. So I would say without energy security, no energy transition. And this is what we are learning now. And it's still the fossil fuels who can be transported across borders, who can be easily stored, who don't have an intermittency problem, which generate energy security. You cannot rely on the sun and the wind when you have a situation like that, and everybody knows it. And that has also psychological effect, which is not good for the energy transition.
And what is that going to mean for the already complicated situation with supply chains, Dr. Rodestina Primova?
You mean the supply chain in general for the low carbon?
Yes, especially that we're having problem shipping coal and other energy supplies, that is.
Yes, not only coal, but also the different raw materials. We have a global supply chain crisis, which has been exacerbated by the war, and so even some equipment for the solar panels are becoming more expensive than before, and there is also global supply chain. So one of the things is also creating, the European Union has adopted the so-called circular economy, and we need to look at the possibility also of producing secondary raw material, creating more local supply chains, and to create centers for smart specialization within the EU. One of the things, so last month, the DG Research and Innovation released the so-called low carbon technological roadmap for the industry sector, where one of the major takeaway also was there is that Europe is producing a lot of goods in terms of research, but has not promoted its sales internationally. So Europe could be also a center for promotion of green innovations, and in particularly green technology innovations. So this gives us also the opportunity to lead on this.
Very nice indeed. And Dr. Christoph Rühl, what's happening with the Rhine right now has happened before. I mean, the last time was in 2018. You know, German industry lost billions of dollars. Then, as a result, is the government going to have to come up with a kind of plan to better deal with this going forward? I mean, can they?
2018 was not a crisis. I mean, it was the same situation in drought. The economic input was manageable because it was a very different external environment. We didn't have the situation, the standoff with Russia and this energy crisis. We didn't have serious attempts at the energy transition, just as a footnote. And most importantly, we were not on the eve of a recession caused by increases in interest rates and all of that. On the contrary, it was a period of very strong growth, and everything seemed to be wonderful. From that perspective, it was easier to manage. But to add to your previous question, if you think about the situation today, where we have already supply chain bottlenecks all over the world, Germany, not China, Germany is still the world's biggest exporter. And Europe exports into US and China. With any kind of increase in supply bottlenecks, that is going to have a multiple impact on the economy. And if you think about energy and the energy transition, most of the required infrastructure, for especially the solar panels, but also windmills increasingly, are coming into Europe from being imported from China, from places like that. So again, any disruption will have an adverse impact. And we are in an economic situation, as you know, where everybody wonders whether we are plunging into recession even without a draft or without a war in the Ukraine. And taking these things together just simply means it's much harder to manage this time.
Absolutely. And Dr. Radostina Primova, I know we talked about this, but I want to take a step back for a moment and look at a wider issue here. And one of the reasons that people are so concerned about all this right now is because of Russia cutting energy supplies to the European Union. From your perspective, is the EU coming up with really an effective strategy for gradually reducing its dependency on Russian gas?
Well, currently we don't see a very coordinated reaction and coordinated support. So the European Union needs something like a European energy and climate security strategy that should realign its decarbonization objectives together with security. We already see how severely Italy and Germany have been affected. By this end, we have started developing a so-called Energy and Climate Security Index, which is like a metrics that measures different components of the security, which is related to affordability, sustainability, geopolitical exposure, and risks. And also, we have found out, for example, that one significant factor, in particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, is energy poverty. So energy poverty, for example, is a serious risk also in the whole energy security dilemma and the affordability in particular of energy, as more than 40%, for example, in winter, households, in particular in Bulgaria, cannot warm up their homes. So it's the vulnerability is very high to disruption of energy supplies, but also within the European Union, we have a mechanism called energy solidarity, which allows basically when two countries sign solidarity agreement, also to facilitate the process of trade of energy goods. Like, for example, we have seen now with the interconnector Bulgaria-Greece and others. So this is an additional mechanism and also an interconnected European energy market. Another thing is also related that the European Union delayed a bit its response to that crisis in terms of negotiating with alternative suppliers from North Africa. So the negotiations started at a later stage than they should have started. So I would say that the European Union has been slow in its reaction and response to the crisis.
Very nice indeed. And perhaps Dr. Christoph Rühl can add to your statement. Do you agree with our distinguished guest about what she just stated, Dr. Rodestina Primova?
Not completely. Of course, the European Union needs more. I think that what we are learning is the European Union doesn't need more fancy programs or strategies or work groups or even indices. There's plenty of that. And words there are enough. What this crisis shows is the European Union has an old and very well-known problem in the way it makes decisions. And this is this principle of unanimity. Whenever the European Commission makes decisions on energy security, either all countries have to unanimously agree, or a qualified majority, usually more than 2/3, have to agree to that, regardless of their population. And this always ends in these night-long discussions and these stalemates, and always creates decisions which reflect the lowest common denominator. You see this most clearly in oil, where first, every country embargoed as much as they could. It wasn't coordinated. It was decentralized. Everybody did what they could. It worked reasonably well. Then they came up with a decision, and the decision was to block the oil which is seaborne, which is the one, which can be easily redirected to Asia, but let the oil through the Druzhba pipeline flow, which would have been the one to stop if you really have a serious embargo in mind. Why? Only because of Hungary and Slovakia, I think, wanted to, were dependent on that oil. So the aggregate outcome with this decision mechanism was worse. Similar in gas. Until recently, until the European Union started to develop strategies and big plans, the situation is actually very much in the disfavor of Russia. Russia accounted for about 40% of the gas consumption in the EU. That's now down to 12%. And this is only because individual countries, Poland, Denmark, Lithuania, have already cut themselves off. Other big countries like Germany and France and Italy have limited gas inputs a lot. So Russia is about to lose that market, which is the real reason why they are now prepared to escalate. And this was done in a decentralized fashion where every country knows that I can coal a little more gas, but I need the coal. Other countries would say, I need the coal. I don't need the coal, but I can cut off the gas. And so this decentralized approach worked better. The problem is it's almost impossible to have a coordinated response with the European Union, which does not fall back on the lowest common denominator. And in serious crisis situation, the lowest common denominator is not good enough.
And Dr. Christoph Rühl, I would like to focus a little bit on Germany here, and when it comes to this bottleneck, when it comes to talking again about the Rhine River, I mean, from your perspective, are there concrete measures that can be taken to ensure that the Rhine can still be used by ships even during times of droughts? Let's say
there is the possibility theoretically of trenching it deeper, as the previous speaker has mentioned. That's not really an option because the river is too long, and the points where you can safely do that are too limited. There is the option, of course, of using more ships and loading less. That's already taking place, but this is just a temporary stopgap measure. And then what happens in reality is that coal and other heavy goods are landed mostly on rail and to some extent also on road transport. And that's where the bottlenecks are created because that system is already fairly clogged up. And already delayed in many aspects. There isn't much more that can be done. In the long term, it is really a problem because, of course, everybody wants to have functioning rivers which can be used for transport. And if the climate situation gets worse, then these droughts will be happening more often. And there is not really anything one can do about that on a local level because that is reflecting a global shift in the climate. And it hopefully in the political discussion gives some new impetus to move ahead with clean energy.
Very nice indeed. And Dr. Rodestina Primova, tell us, according to you, what's the solution for this? Are European governments doing the right things?
Well, the solution is actually very complex because all ecosystems are interconnected. So for me, the root of the crisis the crisis is rooted in a deeper ecological and environmental crisis and climate crisis that we're facing today.
True.
And already, for example, the COVID crisis has once again underscored the importance of environmental factors, increasing deforestation, wildlife intervention, also that have an impact on a number of things like agriculture, foods, our ecosystems. and have repercussions also on human crisis and environmental and economic crisis. So basically, the solutions are very complex. They're related to, in particularly, biodiversity protection, climate change measures, and already there are also a lot of studies that have pointed out the connections between water scarcity, for example, and the security implications for it.
Thank you indeed.
Worldwide. So basically, we need to see the roots of this crisis, where it's coming from, which is coming from the environmental degradation and also the increasing climate crisis that we're facing.
Very nice indeed.
And
as
then
a
the
final
solutions
question,
are very complex. Yeah.
yes, thank you so much. And Dr. Christophe Rühle, as a final question, and briefly, please, since we're run out of time, I know we talked about this earlier, how difficult it is to predict what's going to happen going forward. I mean, there is no crystal ball you can just gaze on into to see what's going to happen. But let me ask you about the mood of the German people right now. Are they largely supportive of the government's policies thus far, or is, real concern growing?
Yes, there's good news here in the sense that way more than 70% or 75% in opinion polls support the current government and support the position of not taking any gas from Russia through the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and support the decision to try to get away from Russian gas. I'm talking to you here from a small village in Germany. I've never seen so much chopped wood in front of the houses. If you go down in the town and you want to buy an electric heater, they're sold out. So people are prepared for a cold winter, but people are quite willing to take that on.
Thank you
and
so
that's,
much.
I think, important, that political support.
All right. Well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation right there. Thank you so much for all of our guests, and thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our YouTube channel, and for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page or Instagram. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is, as you can see here below the screen. From me and the whole team here at All 24 News Special Coverage, thanks and bye for now.